Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mark Dirks, and on behalf of ACRL and Choice, I'd like to welcome you to today's program, Impacts of COVID-19 on Education and Remote Learning, What Comes Next, which is supported by the OECD iLibrary and OECD EDU today. Our discussion today is one in a series of webinars from ACRL and Choice that addresses new ideas, developments, and products of interest to the academic library and research communities. Free to users, these structured 60-minute live presentations provide the opportunity for interactive discussions of important new issues and developments in academic librarianship by librarians, vendors, authors, and a host of interested stakeholders. Before we get started, I would like to point out just a couple of features of the webinar software. For those of you attending today, please know that as you join the presentation, you are automatically muted and your cameras are off. So don't worry about generating noise or feedback or anything like that. We've got that taken care of for you. In the main area of the screen, of course, you should be able to follow along with today's presentation materials. And we are using the Q&A feature today. So please put any questions that you have into that Q&A box. At the end of the presentation, Mr. Schleicher will take as many questions as we have time for. So please feel free to drop those questions in as they occur to you throughout the presentation. Also note that we are recording today's program and that everyone who registered should receive a follow-up email with a link to the archived version. Our presenter today is Andreas Schleicher. Andreas is the Director of Education and Skills and Special Advisor on Education Policy to the Secretary General at the OECD in Paris. He initiated and oversees the Program for International Student Assessment and other international instruments that have created a global platform for policymakers, researchers, and educators across nations and cultures to innovate and transform educational policies and practices. He has worked for over 20 years with ministers and education leaders around the world to improve quality and equity in education. In addition to our guest speaker, the OECD provides multiple access points to their research and data. In addition to the COVID-19 and policy tracker hubs, the OECD iLibrary, data.oecd.org and stats.oec.org provide additional interaction and research resources depending on your need. For more information on these resources, please contact Ian Williamson at iain.williamson@oecd.org. Links and emails, of course, will be provided at the end of the webinar. All right, that is enough out of me. It is my pleasure to turn things over to Mr. Schleicher.
Thank you so much, Mark. These are clearly difficult times also for education. If you look at the extent of school closures, particularly in March and April, at one point we had 1.5 billion young people around the world locked out from their schools. Things have improved since then, but certainly partial school closures are still active in a fair number of countries. That is something that will remain with us for some time. And remote learning sort of became the lifeline for learning in schools, out of schools. But we've also learned it doesn't address many of the important social functions of education. Education is not just a transactional phenomenon. It's first and foremost a relational phenomenon. And the crisis has brought this out very, very clearly. Accreditation has been put at stake. We do no longer know how to examine students when they're not present. At least many of the solutions that exist have not yet been scaled. Teachers have faced a steep learning curve as well. But at the very same time, we've also seen lots of technological innovation, lots of social innovation. There has perhaps been less reform in education, but certainly more change over the last 6 months than maybe in years before around the world. Still, the learning losses that have been incurred are serious. I think we should not downplay this. If you assume that about a third of a school year effectively has been lost, despite the contingency measures, that could translate into 3% of lifetime earnings of the Corona generation. And you can actually, we have done that at the OECD, extrapolate this to our economies. People who are less well-skilled are likely to become less productive workers. You add this all up over the working life of these people, and that could translate to $14 trillion in economic losses. So And obviously, those losses are not equally distributed. Students who had learned to learn on their own, who had access to great digital resources, who had a supportive ecosystem around them, parents included, teachers included, for them, this experience may not have been so bad. But you imagine all those who may not have liked school in the first place, who never did that well in school, who never were well supported at home, who don't have access to digital resources. For them, they were really, really badly hit with this experience. And so it's not just an overall drag on our economies. We're probably also going to see an increased polarization of skills. That's, very hard to assess by now, but clearly that's what we can anticipate. And yet, I want to make one important point. We talk about learning losses, they are serious, but we shouldn't assume that just adding back more time will address our educational challenges for tomorrow. You can already here see, that's for data from 2018, from our PISA assessment, that the volume of learning time varies hugely across countries. You take a country like the United Arab Emirates, where students learn close to 60 hours per week. In school, that's the blue segment, and out of school, that's the yellow segment. And you contrast it with Finland on the left side, where the volume of learning time is just about half of what it is in the United Arab Emirates. But, when you look at productivity, you can see actually students in Finland learn a lot in very little time, whereas students in the UAE spend a lot of time and learn very little. So it's not the volume, it's the quality of learning experiences. And I think this is the challenge of this crisis. Can we, reconfigure the learning experiences, the time, the space, technology, in ways that we address that productivity challenge? Because the reality is, even for a long time after this crisis, schools will run on reduced capacity. Hybrid learning will remain with us, and that means we have to find ways to do things differently. And if you look at the United States, also there, a lot of people say we need more time in school. Actually, the US students spend a fair amount of time in school. Also there, it's more a question of productivity, the utilization of time. A lot of room for improvement in the US to catch up with high-performing education systems in terms of productivity. Now, but let me turn a little bit closer to the crisis. I think one of the things that happened is immediately that when schools were closed, people had to rely on technology. And it's actually quite amazing that among the OECD countries, you can see virtually all education systems were sort of capable to do something in this field. But, I point you to the orange bar. Most of what we've seen is basically teachers using technology to mediate very traditional instruction, using Zoom or other kind of technologies to, do lessons. We've seen actually relatively little of the more innovative uses of technology that we often talk about. Television have played an important role, particularly for younger children, radio even, a mix of technological solutions that have, helped people bridge the pandemic. In some, systems better, in some education systems less. But overall, I think education systems were quicker to adapt than, maybe we would have anticipated from our past experience. One thing when we surveyed countries that I also found really encouraging is that there was a general perception of collaboration in this crisis. Often education is something that's very polarizing. People have views on this, stakeholders are often not, collaborating very closely. But when we surveyed people, you could see 8 out of 10 people saying everybody did all they could to help across countries. Most people said, well, there were some conflicts, but few conflicts with teachers, few conflicts with parents. I think that's something, if we can take a little bit of that spirit for the period after the crisis, the spirit of making education a whole of society project, I think we've won a lot. When you look at the strategies, what countries have tried to achieve, obviously ensuring the continuity of academic learning has been the #1 priority. That's where schools were built for. But what is so interesting that many other aspects that we often consider in afterthought of education, ensuring the well-being of students, ensuring the well-being of teachers, providing professional advice to teachers, ensuring the social development of students. Those things often range into sort of fairly low priorities in education. They have now risen to the top. We've seen suddenly we need a very, very different nature and quality of infrastructure to sustain learning experiences. And so a lot of effort has gone into this across countries. Well, let's go even one step further, and that is, how do we actually get to a new normal? How do we reopen, rebuild our education infrastructure after the pandemic? And of course, a lot of this is now underway. Again, most countries have fairly well advanced in reopening schools. In part, that has also been inspired by better knowledge on pandemics. At the beginning of the crisis, we were very concerned that schools would be super spreaders. Some people call them, cruise ships on land, where people are crowded and a lot of highly risk. I think by now people understand, actually, particularly for younger children, the risks are far more limited. If you want to contain the pandemic, you're much better off, focusing on workplace social distancing, on case isolation, on quarantine, reducing community contact. School closures have contributed something, but probably not as much. At least that's also what evidence from previous epidemics suggests. So I think there's more a nuanced perception of the real risks that schools pose than there was before. And then, of course, lots of measures have been put in place to deal with this. You can see there's been lots of training of students, teachers, and staff on hygiene and barriers, gestures, social distancing protocols. In many schools, students are educated in bubbles so that you don't avoid that everybody mixes with everyone. Common areas are dealt with separately, the canteen, social spaces, mandatory use of masks, quite common now, at least for the older students. Now for the younger, it's more kind of questionable in its effectiveness and utility. Also, one often says that for younger children, it's more disruptive. They are very much rely on facial impression. You take this away, you change the learning experience. So there are, and plus the spread of the risks for smaller students is not as high. So a lot has happened in making schools safe places. Now that's something that has also improved a lot across countries. Not everybody does as well as countries like Korea and Japan on this, that they had already lots of experience from the past. They had good contingency plans. But I think meanwhile, you can say many school systems have found ways to make schools reasonably safe places to learn so that they can coexist with the virus. No, that was not the case when the pandemic struck initially. No. And that's also, when we ask in May, that was some months down the track, we ask education systems, what are you going to do when you reopen schools? And you can basically see now school closures are just the last resort. No? That happens in very targeted cases and often specific situations where incidence rates are very high and there's sort of evidence of contagion. Whereas the other means are more, well, we may close a classroom, we may test the students and the staff, or the affected students or teachers will be required to quarantine. So you can see now much more nuanced measures. One reason I highlight this is that, of course, that requires a lot of operational capacity in schools. You need school leaders who can actually deal with those situations. You need school leaders who can communicate with parents, build that kind of trust, because, parents are not going to give their children to an environment where not, they have 100% trust. So you have a lot of, issues put on the shoulders of school leaders and their staff to manage this situation. But I must say, from the reports that we get, there are not so many problem cases. I think generally, I think the news on this are fairly good. One of the areas that has got very high on the policy agenda is the well-being of students. Students, particularly students from disadvantaged backgrounds, were really left badly behind. And you can see many countries are actually now trying to sort of create special support measures, counseling, support for students who may have been victims of violence at home, supporting students in psychological distress, and so on. A lot of, intentions, but look at the orange bar. There's actually very little additional staff available. Additional school doctors, nurses, psychologists, specialized teachers. Now that's the reality. Basically, these people are needed everywhere. Even if we had the money, it's very difficult for school systems to hire. So in practice, this means a lot of those responsibilities end up with teachers. As a teacher, in and after the pandemic, you're not just an instructor. You need to be a coach, a mentor, a social worker, a facilitator, an evaluator. Sort of teachers' responsibility and merit and mandate have been dramatically broadened. For some countries, that was not so different. If you go particularly to education systems in Northern Europe or East Asia, teachers always have a lot of non-teaching responsibilities. They teach a lot less than an American teacher, but they do work a lot more on other things, particularly social welfare. So there, this was less unusual for teachers, but still, I think a lot more work on the shoulders of educators. Now, technology, a big player in the crisis, probably first to conserve existing practice, not that much yet in terms of transforming educational practice. But again, I think there's great potential in this. And one of the most interesting findings from our survey of countries in May was that just about 22% of education systems think that they want to go back to business as normal. So you can see actually very few schools that basically see the future as the past. Look at the yellow one. Over half of the school systems see hybrid learning as the new normal. Now, hybrid learning challenges almost anything that we do in education. It challenges that education is a space because you suddenly make it an activity. It's about integrating the physical world and the virtual world. It's about understanding how different students learn differently and supporting them with a much more personalized approach that, embraces the home environment, the school environment, all of this. That is hugely challenging as a concept. So implementation obviously is a real struggle. And you can see, it first of all relies on that students are equipped at home in that they have the internet, a study place, computer, and that looks reasonably good for students from wealthy families. But as soon as you go to students from disadvantaged families, and that's true even in a country like the United States, wealthy country, as soon as you go into more disadvantaged communities, you find lots of students without, stable access to the internet, or where the parents need the computers that are available and things like this. So that is obviously, that resource gap is one that has hindered online learning and amplified inequalities. When it comes to the equipment in schools, this is still survey data from 2018, but you can see actually the United States does very, very well on this. You have actually more computers than students. That is very different in the majority of countries for which we have comparative data. So yeah, technology, the physical hardware seems to be quite well, equipped in the United States. And that is even true in fairly disadvantaged schools. We could not see as much of a social gap in the schools than what we could see in the homes of people. But when you look at bandwidths, there things start to look differently. You can see there the United States is no longer at the frontier. You have a fair number of countries, regions in China, Lithuania, Singapore, Slovenia, Denmark, Sweden, New Zealand, Netherlands, Hong Kong, Korea, there where actually bandwidth is less of an issue. And here I want to point you also to the social gap. There's a quite significant gap in the US between privileged and disadvantaged neighborhoods. Not so much in the computers, but as soon as you look at internet access. And then, when you think about the technology is only as good as it's actually being deployed. Here you can see when you ask, do teachers actually have sufficient time to prepare lessons integrating digital devices? School leaders say, well, actually, that's more an issue. It's true for, the majority, but there's a significant minority where there is insufficient support, insufficient time. And then, do they have the technical and pedagogical skills to actually integrate digital devices in instruction? Here you can see the United States slips further behind. And again, look at the social gap. Now, if you come from an advantaged area, well, 85% of school leaders say, yeah, my teachers have all those skills. If you get into a disadvantaged neighborhood, it's just a little bit more than half. So again, this is something that teacher qualification seems to be socially regressive, not just in the United States, but also in the United States. And these issues are, of course, much harder to address. You can roll out, laptops, computers very quickly, but to upgrade the human capacity is a much bigger challenge. how do teachers themselves learn? That's another question that we ask ourselves. And you can see, for example, in countries like Korea or in Shanghai in China, the virtual world is the natural world for teachers to learn. They connect every day with other teachers. They're engaged, in social platforms. They share their lesson plans, their projects. They work in professional learning communities. The digital world is the world of teachers in those countries. But those are the exceptions. The United States is in good company of the countries where most training of teachers happened in courses and seminars where you have to go. Now, suddenly COVID strikes and that's out of the question. So actually most of the teachers are left on their own devices because they have not been used to the digital world as a world of learning. They have worked in isolation in their classrooms, gone back to university, but they are not connected in a kind of collaborative culture that really enhances learning. No, I think that's a big, big challenge. Again, something not easy to change overnight. And we also need to say that education is just at the very, very beginning of the digitalization agenda. When you look at, market capitalization and compare health, the kind of brown bars here, with education, you can barely see global education market capitalization. Tiny compared with health. We have a huge health industry and we have very, very little in education. Less than 3% of global education expenditure is on technologies today. So tiny beginnings. It's likely to grow. Now we predict by 2025, we're going to see that rising in absolute terms, but even in relative terms. But even in the best of those scenarios, you talk about a little bit more than 4% of spending going to edtech. So I think these are huge challenges for us to actually advance that field. Where is the money going? Augmented reality, virtual reality, very big, and that's understandable. That's where the greatest sort of wins in the short term lie. Why would you listen to a teacher explaining an experiment to you when you can now do that experiment in a virtual laboratory? Artificial intelligence coming up, and then robotics, blockchain. Those are the kind of areas where we see most investment being made. But I must also say, those investments are mainly a story about China, just one country. Over half of the global venture capital in education today is just about China. If you look back, 10 years ago, it used to be the United States. It was by far the number one. Now the United States is one of many, and basically most of those developments happen elsewhere. So a lot of things to catch up. Now, what is the potential? Is about new learning experiences. I think virtual reality, augmented reality allow not just academic learning, but you can make learning much more practical, hands-on, interesting, engaging, and most importantly, you can connect it with learning at home. So a lot more personalized learning than we had seen before. Learning analytics, again, we can now use technology to see how different students learn differently and enable teachers to see those differences in real time. Personally, I've seen lots of amazing examples of this, also most notably in Asia. But there, basically, technology is really an enabler, an empowerment tool for teachers. And the interesting thing is that a lot of those developments have not come, governments pushing ideas into schools. No, they're actually about finding good ideas in schools and scaling them and spreading them. You have really very strong professional communities of educators putting together very, very interesting solutions. Assessment and exams, that's probably the next frontier, but I think the crisis has really shown us that our current systems are not adequate for the context that we change. Many exam systems have actually literally broken down now because we do not longer know how to assess students. And I think also here technology opens up just amazing spaces. In medical industry, you can see students doing operations or trying operations in kind of virtual reality environments. We see a lot of hands-on assessment in vocational settings, assessments becoming more adaptive. Like PISA, you do not longer give every student exactly the same test, but you adapt that test to the student's capabilities. Machine rating of essays is coming up. And so I think there's a lot happening on this front here. I think the promise in the long run is that at the moment, assessment tends to take things away from learning. Many educators don't like it because it steals time. You have to devote time on this and training students, and then the real assessment. In the future, probably we're going to see assessment and learning becoming much more fully integrated. So that basically while you study, the computer is going to study you and then giving you sort of individual feedback, but an assessment to improve your learning. That's the future. Blockchain, that's probably less developed yet in education, but it holds great promise in making accreditation much more granular. Micro-credentials, all of those things will actually blossom in blockchain environments. And you can see, again, this is our survey in May, lots of investment, lots of effort going into those fields and upgrading the infrastructure to the times in which we live. Now, I want to spend the last 5 minutes just to give you a glimpse of how the future might look like. Now, I think the pandemic has shown us that the future likes to surprise us. It's very, very hard to anticipate things. And therefore, rather than anticipating one single future, it's sometimes better to just think of multiple futures, and then prepare yourself for different kinds of scenarios. We do a lot of this work at the OECD, and some of those events that may sort of surprise us may be foreseeable, have a smaller impact or a bigger impact. Climate change is a good example. We know it's probably going to have a huge impact, but we can anticipate this. We can plan for this. We can build strategies for this. That's less the case for a pandemic, that strikes us completely out of the blue. Very, very hard to deal with this. And then, lots of other things that come up. And then artificial intelligence probably is going to be the big game changer in ways that we cannot possibly predict by now. So the future will surprise us. And that's why, thinking in terms of scenarios is so important. And I just want to share a few thoughts with you on this. Now, one scenario is, of course, that the status quo will evolve, but it will not fundamentally change. That's a scenario of evolution rather than revolution. Now, you're going to see educational monopolies in terms of our education systems remaining. Schools will be remaining the key actors of socialization, qualification, care, even credentialing. Now, we're going to see probably more technology, more innovation in the learning experiences, and the teachers will retain their distinctive role as, the gatekeepers in this form of education. Not an unlikely scenario, quite possible one. And, then you have to ask yourself, well, is it possible to change and innovate these large tankers of school systems? No. That is so difficult, so many stakeholders involved, so many vested interests involved, big challenges. Another scenario is, and actually the COVID crisis has brought us pretty close to something like this, that we were going to see a continued fragmentation of demand. We have parents, making their own choices, looking for other kinds of solutions. You see schooling systems becoming players in a wider market, not just, local, maybe national, maybe global. And we can see the diversity of instructional roles and also teaching statuses. That's sort of the kind of outsourcing scenario. And, it may not go completely in that direction, but we can see a combination of the first and the second. But again, if something like this happened, how do we retain the idea of an education system? How do we reconcile flexibility with equity? How will access to infinite information and training options change the nature of teaching, the role of teachers? Those are big questions that will arise under this. Or we could see the opposite trends. Schools remain, but they become much more sort of integrative centers of our communities. If you go to Sweden today, to Finland, to Estonia, you see that schools are not just learning, centers. They actually take on a big chunk of the social roles, of health, of support, of family support, and so on. And maybe, of intergenerational learning, maybe we're going to see more of that. That's sort of almost the opposite of the outsourcing scenario now. And but then again, you need a lot of local capacity for making this happen. And I just wanted to show you one data point on this. Many people in the United States would say, well, that is a system of local control. Basically, a lot of decisions are made at the local level. And that's formally true if you think the local level is school districts. But if you put yourselves in the shoes of a school leader or a teacher, actually schools in the United States have a lot less discretion than schools in most OECD countries. Compare that with the Netherlands, where basically over 90% of all decisions are made in schools. In the United States, that's less than 20%. Again, in the United States, you have a big role for local communities and some role for the state. So that's something to consider. No? If you go for a scenario where schools are becoming more, active players in the education system, that has huge implications on, their capacity. And our data from PISA actually show that the autonomy, the responsibility, the role of school leaders and teachers in the system is something that's quite predictive of the quality of outcomes in the long run. Effects that we do not see for schools governing boards or local or regional authorities or even national education authorities. So again, those scenarios will have implications. Or, eventually, maybe, traditional goals and functions of schooling will be entirely overwritten by technology. No? We're going to learn everywhere, anytime. No? The distinctions between formal and informal learning will no longer be relevant. Nobody knows. But I think it's important for us to think in terms of those kinds of scenarios, in terms of alternative futures, rather than locking our planning just in one set of assumptions. To what extent, do we want to balance modernizing and disrupting education systems? How do we align new goals with old structures? How do we reconcile the global and the local? How do we reconcile innovation and risk avoidance? That is very important in education too. Everybody wants reform and change in education except for their own children. How do we align the potential with the reality at the front line, the capacity constraints, the virtual with the face-to-face, and last but not least, learning with education? So those are some of the questions I wanted to leave you with, and I look forward to our discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And we have several questions already in the hopper from attendees. So if I would just encourage folks, if you do have additional questions, please feel free to drop those in the Q&A module. And as I said, we will take some time to answer as many as we can. All right, the first question that we have here is from Amy. And Amy asks, now that we're 6 months beyond the collection of this data, what changes have been seen to the outcomes and the numbers? Do you have any perspective on that?
Yeah, we don't have a new survey, but obviously we work very closely with countries all around the world. And in many countries, things are quite well on track overall, I must say. I think where problems occur, they tend to be localized, they're dealt with locally with, but I would say most education, in the OECD countries, I speak only for the countries that are in the kind of industrialized world, but there I think the problems are under control. You can see, for example, in Europe, many countries are now severely affected by the pandemic, and still schools remain open. I think that's a big achievement and a big difference to the first wave of the pandemic. So on that part, I'm quite positive. When I think about, the deep transformation of education, are we using technology in smarter ways? I'm not sure we are that much further than we were 6 months ago.
Excellent, very interesting. We have a question here from Antonius, and Antonius asks, can you show me any data about student engagement in online class?
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, we have very interesting data from our PISA survey. It's not, post-COVID, I must say, but I think that is not probably going to have that much of an impact. And what those data shows that we should actually be quite cautious. Most of the technology use has led to less engagement than more engagement. I'm not, blaming technology for that alone. It could also be the pedagogies that underpin it. I would even go one step further. I cannot even see a positive relationship between student learning outcomes and technology intensity in classrooms. In some countries, it actually is in most countries, it's a kind of curvilinear relationship. A little bit of technology seems to be something, and then more technology making learning more superficial and more destructive. And but again, I think the challenge here is to develop smarter uses of technologies. And if you look at some of the education systems that are furthest on this agenda, you think about, advanced regions in China, you actually don't see many computers in the classroom. The technology is all in the background, in scanners, in sensors that actually, gives teachers and students real-time information. But you don't see sort of so much, working on a tablet or on a computer.
Excellent. Again, very interesting. We have a question here from Lynn, who asks, do you see higher education, both graduate and undergraduate models, needing to change as well as online learning that's still not pervasive in higher education, for example, in PhD programs? Do you see higher education needing to change?
Well, I must say, I find actually the developments and evolution in higher education perhaps even more disappointing than what we have seen in the school level. I think many universities had a really hard time in adapting. And some of the, I don't want to generalize this, but some of the quality of online courses that universities have developed are, highly questionable. I would even say, universities need to rethink their value proposition. Students do not go to university and pay a lot of money to consume online courses that are of mediocre quality. They go to university to meet great professors, to have interesting discussions, to work in a laboratory, to experience a social life. And if universities want to capitalize on digitalization, they have to think harder about what it takes to create those engaging environments. Now, I don't think it's done simply in school. I think that is it's to some extent easier to do. And but I also think school systems have probably been more quicker and more proactive in changing their learning environments than I have seen in universities in general.
Great. And we've got a question here from Esther, who asks, could you talk more about the collaboration between educational stakeholders and the ways of making education a priority for the whole community?
Yeah, again, there are some countries that have a great tradition with this. I think, again, if you look at some of the countries in Northern Europe, education has always been a kind of whole of society project. And that starts with the way in which the responsibilities of teachers are structured. Now, teachers typically teach a lot less than an American teacher, but they spend a lot more time with students out of the classroom. They spend a lot more time with parents. They spend a lot more time getting outside learning experience into schools, the integration of work and learning, the integration of, societal resources in schooling. So a lot of thought goes into making schools a kind of hub of learning, and bringing also people on the course. They found that particularly for students with disadvantaged backgrounds, it's very important for schools to proactively reach out to communities, to parents, to make sure that everybody is behind that mission. That's also a great strength of education systems like Japan, like Singapore, where you can really see communities rallying behind their schools, their education systems. And at the end of the day, those are the countries that are also willing to make investments in their future. Now, you can see basically when you make school a center of a community, you can see communities get behind the cause of schooling. They don't see schooling just as a service provider, but they are, part of that process. And I do think that's something many education systems have, and the COVID crisis has really shown that. You really relied on the help of everybody in this moment. And if you didn't have that help, as a school leader, if you didn't know who to talk to in your communities, in your families, you had a very hard time.
Excellent. Yeah, that's so interesting to think about, the ways in which societies have organized to take on these challenges. We've got another question here from Eugenia, who says, how do you see the training and retraining of teachers around the world to face these scenarios, the things you've been talking about?
Yeah, this is, I think, one of the biggest challenges that we face. And even I wouldn't use the word training, because it sort of presumes we do with teachers what we do with students. We just put them in, some setting and then expect that they upgrade their skills. I actually think schooling in the future, school needs to become a place where everybody learns. It's the students who learn, it's the teachers who learn, it's the parents who learn. and they need to be conducive in their work organization and support structures to facilitate this. Now, giving teachers good and valuable time to engage in professional learning communities. We spend so much time usually to push new and sometimes old ideas into schools top down, and we spend so little time in finding the great ideas in classrooms and looking for ways to scale and spread them. And that is about, engaging teachers as researchers, as co-designers, as co-constructors of innovative learning environments, and ensuring that teachers know what happens in other classrooms, in other schools. Classroom observation is a very powerful tool for teacher learning. And I think those kinds of devices will be very important. Will we succeed to make a school a workplace for teachers where you learn? I also believe that's going to be key for the attractiveness of education. For the United States, you can say, well, teaching is financially not attractive. That's why people don't go to become teachers. That's probably true, but I think the bigger challenge is that teaching is intellectually not attractive. It doesn't offer teachers great careers. It doesn't offer them, great learning experience, great experiences to work with their colleagues. And I think those questions really need to be addressed. So it's not about, adding more training courses for teachers. It's about creating a more immersive, collaborative work environment, combining sort of professional autonomy with a collaborative culture.
Excellent. Yeah, a lot of big challenges and interesting opportunities there. We have a question here from Amelia, who asks, do you have more data about teacher CPD?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Actually, we have a teacher survey that we conduct every 5 years where we collect a lot of data about teacher learning, professional development, but we also look at learning opportunities at school. We look at the extent to which you go to courses or engage with colleagues, sort of school-based versus university-based learning. And all of that actually does relate to the quality of the work environment. It's harder to make connections with student learning outcomes because there are just so many intervening factors, but you can clearly see where teachers engage in more collaborative professional development, they usually feel a greater sense of self-efficacy and ownership. Where teachers engage in more classroom observation, same story, and even job satisfaction. That's some of the things that I found most interesting in this. When we compare, CPD and money, actually the CPD often has a greater impact, and the work organization and schooling has a greater impact on job satisfaction than, simply the money that people get.
Wow,
if you're interested, the survey is called TALIS, and it comes out every 5 years. That was last in 2018, and there's a lot of data about the United States in comparison with other countries.
Excellent, excellent. We have a question here from Albert, who asks, the private sector adopted online working massively. Is it now massively pushing for more online education as well?
Well, as I said, in the COVID pandemic, most of the online learning that we have seen is basically technology mediated learning of teaching by teachers. So we have not seen so much independent provision. Sort of magic AI-based learning platforms. They do exist, but I don't think they have scaled to the extent that they might have. I think most of the online learning that we have seen so far has been fairly traditional and very much relied on teachers. That's also very important to keep in mind, that it has not made teachers less important, but teachers a lot more important.
Excellent. So we have a question here from Anne about the data behind the presentation. And Anne asks, is the study behind these constructs and parameters published somewhere? Can one access the actual reports that fed into this presentation, and where?
Absolutely. In fact, my colleagues from the OECD will be happy to put all of this online. Most of the data was drawn from our PISA study. Everything where you saw, student learning involved, that comes from our PISA survey. Some of the data came from our TALIS survey, and then the system level data came from a special survey that we conducted in May on the COVID situation.
Great, great. We have another question here from Kirsten. And Kirsten comments, it's a very interesting presentation. I'm interested in the association between academic outcomes and the proportion of decisions at each level of governance. There was a lot packed into that slide, and I'd be interested in hearing a bit more detail about that, a bit more discussion.
Yeah, of course, that's a very complex issue. But when you just make a kind of system level regression, you do generally see that education systems that are high performing tend to have more frontline capacity and more frontline responsibility. That is not, a straight line, but it's a pretty robust system level correlation. When you drill down further, it works out quite differently when it comes to decisions that relate to content, curriculum design, assessment, discipline, versus money. And in fact, what we do find is that the professional autonomy on content matters more in terms of success in student learning outcomes than the autonomy in level of resources. And I say this because in the United States, it's often the opposite. Basically, there is more discretion on resources than there is on content at the school level. What we also find when you look at the different layers, that the kind of flexibility for teachers and schools are the biggest, correlate most strongly with system level outcomes, student learning, and then the local levels and the state levels, we see less of a relationship. That's of course hiding a lot of interesting variation. You then need to ask yourself, what is the causal nature of those relationships? What are the drivers of that relationship? And then we've done actually some interesting studies on this. A big part of this is really the idea of professional autonomy, where you make people, give a lot of ownership to professional practice. You create shared practice. You get teachers at the frontier, and they get very interested in kind of innovation in education. And when you do that in a collaborative way, you combine that autonomy with a collaborative culture, you can really raise the status of the teaching profession. And as you could see, also the quality of learning. So these are some of our heuristics to explain that relationship. Whereas a lot of the education systems that are highly prescriptive basically then get teachers who just deliver what they're intended to deliver without taking that level of personal responsibility.
All right, we've got another question here from Philip, who asks, digital resources and tools, especially lately, are in abundance. What's the best way to determine what is worth using?
I think that's a great question. I really think our biggest challenge is in curating the resources. There's a lot out there, a lot of mediocre quality. A lot is simply about replicating what teachers do in normal ways. And if you have that choice, just do normal teaching. I think using technology to do exactly what you would do in a normal lesson makes things more expensive, but not better. So I think the question, when you look at digital resources that are really transformative, I think that is where the challenge of curation still is there. And my answer would be, again, the people who can do that best are the people in the classrooms. I think getting teacher, professional communities really working on this, sharing practice on what works best in what situation is what is needed to make good judgments on this. And I think also this is an area where governments have done reasonably well to regulate, textbooks and the kind of provision. I think we have a lot of kind of criteria for do this well. I don't think we have yet much of a clue how to actually regulate, quality control for digital resources. But I do think that is important too. I don't think you can leave it totally up to teachers to figure all of this out for themselves.
Excellent. We've got another question here from Amy, who asks, how do you see these changes supporting equity in education while also protecting student privacy?
Yeah, particularly in the technology-based age, I think that's going to be one of the big tensions that we will see in the future. Now, technology can be a huge enabler of equity. You can see how different students learn differently. You can engage with them. You can support them with much more personalized kind of provision. But, those things rely on learning analytics. They rely on big data. And then, you get into this question of how you actually deal with those data in responsible ways. Again, it's a question, I think, where the education profession should much more deeply engage with. I don't think you can expect this is going to be sorted out by the tech industry alone. I think the users of those technologies really need to establish a view and a voice on this. And this is not easy. And I think it's everywhere, in Europe, we have this big discussion, we see Korea and China being so successful with an app to fight the pandemic, because they track people. And so huge potential in this, but, where is the trade-off with privacy? And I think it comes very much into equities about accepting and understanding how people learn differently. And as soon as you do that, you need to have individual kind of data. You need to engage with kind of personal aspects, and that makes it so difficult. But, I don't think that is so different than when you let that up to individual teachers, whether teachers have to make those same kind of judgments. It's much easier to teach in an industrial environment. But again, our current education systems are so far from being equitable that I don't think that's the answer.
Excellent. We have another question here from Imed, who says, in some countries, teachers, especially in primary schools, do not have the required content knowledge to teach some core subjects. How can we help those teachers?
That's very difficult for us to assess. We do not have an assessment of content knowledge of teachers, but generally I would agree that that content knowledge is absolutely crucial. It's probably, as a good teacher, you need to not only have great knowledge of your subject, you need to have a passion for this. This is what students are going to see first. You need to understand how different students learn that content differently. I think that's the kind of pedagogical part. You need to know your students. I think those three elements are so fundamental for success of teachers, but very, very hard to assess. And then, to upgrade content knowledge is hard. I think to upgrade pedagogical skills, I think that's something which you can learn with your fellow teachers. Content knowledge, if you miss that, through initial teacher training, I think that's much, much harder to make up for later on.
Okay. We have a question here from Maria, who asks, many for-profit companies have used the pandemic to promote questionable edtech products, questionable in terms of ethics and effectiveness. And schools have really jumped at the opportunity, making these companies incredibly profitable. What implications does the adoption of problematic edtech tools, for example, proctoring software or something like that, have for the future of education?
Well, again, I do believe that the profession, teachers, school leaders, parents need to engage much more closely with that question. Rather than be consumers of technology, become designers of those kinds of technology solutions. Work with the tech companies to think about, what will work best for what situation. I think that is the only way to address this issue. The future will be, about a lot more technology in education and schooling. But again, you don't want to see schools at the kind of end of the assembly line. You want schools to be a driver of the design, development, and implementation of those technologies. We see education to be far too fragmented to accomplish this at the moment. Now, the teaching profession is highly fragmented. Schools are highly fragmented. Often you have schools don't even know what happens in the neighboring school. So I think you need to address those issues. There needs to be better knowledge. But also, I think a greater engagement of the profession in this. And if I look at the countries like Estonia that are very, very good in technology, that's what you see. You have basically the teachers working in research groups and then asking the tech companies to actually invent, design, redesign products. And then I think this becomes a constructive relationship. It's not public versus private, it's public with private.
Excellent. So, absolutely. Teachers advocating and being involved in the production of these things. That makes a lot of sense. We have a question here from Jocelyn, who asks, first off, she says, I appreciated hearing this data. I'm interested in your thoughts about going forward post-COVID. Will the OECD put together a lessons learned and perhaps recommendations for best practices moving forward? Anything like that in the works?
Actually, and I encourage you, we have a hub at the OECD where we're doing exactly that. And we do not do this just after the fact. We've done this during the entire month. Like by now we have, I think, 46 contingency stories so far. Sometimes these are cities, sometimes these are countries, but we have looked really at the most innovative ways of addressing the crisis. Some are coming from the developing world. We often struggle with online learning, and then, we end up doing this in a very patchy way with, half-baked software with insufficient access. We were working with the city of Bogota in Colombia, and they basically saw from the outset, we have no chance to implement online learning. Why don't we, just use mobile technology? They work with the mobile companies and said, why don't you give free broadband access for educational purposes? Then they work with content providers. Can't you make your content accessible on the mobile phone? And there's some really, really innovative solutions in countries that couldn't afford, what we talk about.
Excellent. All right, we've got a question here from Esther, who asks, what role can libraries play in supporting educational stakeholders?
I think the role of it's one of the hallmarks of many high-performing education systems is the culture of libraries. It's not just big public libraries, but they have libraries in the school. They nourish this idea that you have a resource where you can actually not just find books, but also find support and advice on how to read or what to read. And I do think, particularly in a time where the world becomes more complex, more volatile, to have a resource of curated material to read, I think is very, very important. We don't have a shortage of information, a shortage of knowledge. You can't find everything on Google, but who helps you navigate ambiguity, manage that complexity, find your way through all of those resources? I think that's a really important role that libraries can play, but you need to bring them very close to schools. And I think that's the challenge. How do you make sort of those resources really accessible in everyday life of schools? If you go to Finland, that's usually often seen as the paradise for education. You find no school with a really good library.
Interesting, very interesting. We have a question here from Gonzalo, who says, with all this data, when and how are we going to get a projection of what would be the best road to find a balance in the future of education between remote versus on-site participation?
Yeah, I think, that balance will evolve as technology evolves. And I do think, we should not throw the human dimension overboard because we're blinded by technology. I do think we should, strike this balance carefully, keeping in mind that the heart of education is always relational. It's not, transactional. It's not about consumption of content. It's about, being an active learner in this. And that's the quality that you want to develop. You don't want people to just absorb tons and tons of factual knowledge. You want them to, be able to think like a scientist, think like a mathematician. You want them to really develop agency, curiosity. And I think that's something where, every day we should review that balance very carefully in light of what's technologically possible, but also what is meaningful and good for what age of students.
Excellent. Looking at the clock, I think we've got time for maybe just one more quick question. And I think we'll take that one from Carolyn, who says, the importance of supporting student and teacher well-being has grown during this time, as you pointed out. Are there examples of where countries are focusing on this effectively on a national level, or is it more dependent on the various stakeholders in the country?
I think there's a lot of awareness also at system levels. That's sort of one of the things that really rose from nowhere to very close to the top. You could see this in the list of priorities of most education systems. This idea of student well-being, particularly what educators have seen, school systems have seen, where students feel isolated, don't feel that sense of belonging. They just no remote learning is going to reach them. That building that kind of relationship, I think, is very important. And the same for teachers. For teachers, the learning curve has been really, really steep, and the kind of traditional support culture in the school is broken down when schools are closed. So teachers are on their own, need support. And I think that's a big kind of area of attention at the system level. But then, of course, in practice, it often depends on what happens at very local levels. Now, it highlights again why it's so important to develop a more collaborative culture in the teaching profession, where teachers have a more regular practice of sharing, their professional but also personal experience.
Excellent. Well, as we wrap up here, I would just say thank you so much, Mr. Schleicher, for your time today and for presenting really just a fascinating presentation. I would take a moment to remind folks out there that, of course, we are recording the program today, so be on the lookout for that follow-up email with the link to it. And if you have just a couple of minutes as we wind down here to respond to a brief survey, you should see that come up as we log out here. And of course, to all of you out there joining us today, we thank you very much for your time, and we hope to see you in the near future on another program. Thanks so very much.